For those of you who I don't know, my name is Jane Holton. I'm here with my academic hat on today, but for those of you who are worried that something's happened and you weren't told, no, I still have my other hat on too, just not today. Alan's already introduced me as the anti-tobacco queen. I do have other strings to my bow, however, and anyone wants to talk to me about plain packaging of tobacco, I could bore you for hours, so just start me. We have now heard about some of the foundations, and what we're going to do now is to move from death to life, and we're going to hear, well, it's good to move from death to life, I think. We're going to hear now about healthy life expectancy and years lived with disability. In common with the earlier session, we are going to hear from two distinguished speakers with a similar focus on timeliness, particularly as we're starting this session late. And then we're going to have a number of discussants, 3 to be precise, and I'm going to similarly ask them to be incredibly time efficient. I'll just introduce the speakers to you, but I will do it briefly because I am conscious that we'd like to hear them speak rather than perhaps read their CVs, which you're quite able to do. Our first speaker today will be Theo Vos, who's the Director and Professor at Queensland University. Is there a common theme, although he tells me he's jumping ship. He is, of course, very eminent in this field, and in particular has been part of the core team leading the update of the Global Burden of Disease study. I might leave the rest of his distinguished CV for you to peruse at your leisure. Secondly, and no less distinguished, we have Joshua Solomon from Harvard School of Public Health, and he is the Professor of Global Health. Similarly, he has wide-ranging interests, but particularly he has some interest in health policy and in decision science, and he looks particularly at global priority setting, again very relevant to today's discussion, and particularly some of those questions you so challengingly threw to the last panel. As our discussants, we have Duncan Selby, who goes under the title for today of Chief Executive Designate of Public Health England, and he's been working in the NHS since 1980. He and I will have to compare notes about how long we've worked in our health systems. It sounds like we've been there both about the same amount of time. He's also had a distinguished career, including in managing services, but also from a strategic perspective. Our second discussant today will be John Powles, who is from the Department of Public Health and Primary Care. He's the Honorary Senior Visiting Fellow, the Cambridge Institute of Public Health. He will also share an accent which is seeming a little common today. He graduated with a degree in medicine from Sydney University and has been doing also lead work on the global burden of disease, and particularly with interests in respect of issues such as salt and a number of other things. Finally, Miki Chopra, who I suspect probably needs almost no introduction to this audience, Chief of Health and Associate Director of Programs at UNICEF, of course, in New York, and he has held that role since 2008. So on that basis, perhaps we might get straight into the content and we might welcome Theo to the podium.
Thank you, Jane. I guess I call myself one of the 400-odd GBD 2010 survivors. And linking in with the call on prohibition, I'm wondering whether for all us GBD junkies that would be a solution. I'm changing topic to years lived with disability. And this has been one of the more striking things that have come out of previous versions of the burden of disease, that it's not just mortality that matters, but there are a lot of long-term and short-term problems that cause a lot of health loss and that are associated with a large amount of expenditure that governments and other health providers give to the population. So I'll say something about the methods in as brief as I can, show some results and some overall reflections on having done this work over the last 5 years. First of all, we changed the approach to how we measure the non-fatal health outcomes. Probably most important is that rather than a convoluted method where most of the data is on prevalence and we then try and derive incidence and duration, we now stick with prevalence as our main measure to quantify the years lived with disability. Also very important, where in the past we tended to get away with doing things within a small group of us with few people actually looking over our shoulder. There are many more people that look over our shoulder, but we also changed to a true systematic review of all the data that we could find on a particular topic area, rather than in the previous enterprises where the analytical tools forced us from the amount of available information to choose a particular set of age-specific, sex-specific estimates and run with those. So there was a lot of influence of the actual operator on what information was used. The checking of consistency between various disease parameters, that has remained the same. Importantly, this time we've made adjustments for comorbidity, whereas we've largely ignored that, barring a few national studies in the past. Important, as Alan mentioned already, is the systematic propagation of uncertainty from all the input data to each of the results. And an important shift in how we derive the disability weights, listening to criticism that has been liberally voiced in the literature on the methods in the past, using rather difficult mind games that we call person trade-off, and limited to small sets of health experts, rather than a broader consultation with the population for whom these results are translating into decisions. So the analytical steps, they start with a systematic review and collation of all data sources that are available. And by having so many different data sources collected by different people with different methods, we try to flag key issues both in the characteristics of how the studies had been conducted, like definitions of the condition, how the study was conducted, how representative was the study of the whole population in which it was conducted, as well as a number of characteristics of the countries where the studies were conducted, to help us predict what the true underlying estimates were that we are interested in, with the definitions that we set for each disease or health state. So we made use of those characteristics of each study, of the countries of those studies, call that in our jargon the covariates, and try to adjust the data points so that each contributing data point was at a level playing field with the ideal definition of a disease that we had set. Then we used a tool called DISMOD-MR. MR stands for meta-regression. And A.B. Flaxman, who is here in the audience, has endured almost daily Skype calls for the last 3-4 years with me to try and develop the tool. And at the same time, I've learned a lot about Bayesian statistics, well, largely using the jargon, not really understanding the ins and outs of it. But we use this to bring all those data together, make sense of them in a comparable way, and then try to pull the information to come up with the best possible estimate, given everything we know about the disease, for a particular year, for a particular population. And at the same time, as we used to do in the past, try to reconcile the parameters of incidence and prevalence and mortality risk and duration. But our aim was to get prevalence, or prevalent cases, because that would be used in our calculations of years lived with disability. I'll now show you a few examples of our analyses in DISMOD. Anxiety disorders. On the left, you see the unadulterated input data for Australasia with data from 1997 to 2010. Each horizontal bar is a data point for a particular age range, and the vertical bar through it is the amount of uncertainty around that data point. Now you can see that the data points in the left graph are way higher than in the right. In the right graph, we've applied those adjustments, largely for anxiety disorder. These are adjustments because many data points reflect prevalence in the last year, whereas for describing the epidemiology, we're interested in who has it at the moment of a survey. So we made adjustments from 1 year prevalence to point prevalence that we were interested in. Hence, a lot of these data points came down because there are more people in the past year who say they've had an anxiety disorder than when you ask people, have you got it now? And then you can see the method of pooling in the solid blue line in the right-hand graph and the grayish-bluish area around it, the uncertainty, what the tool Desmod made of this diversity of data for this particular part of the world and made a central estimate with uncertainty around it. Just to show you that sometimes things don't match. This is data from North America, high income, for the period before 1997, and this is osteoarthritis of the knee. So we have a number of data points on incidence, new cases identified with osteoarthritis knee, and we have a whole lot of data points on prevalence. Now, even before doing any formal consistency check, if you look at the data on incidence with some estimates as high as 5% incidence, so 5% of the population being a new case of osteoarthritis of the knee, you already know that it being a chronic condition, that you can never match those prevalence figures because it's way too high. And that's exactly what Desmod told us. There's no way I can reconcile this unless I do not do justice to prevalence nor do justice to incidence. And so this is an example where we said we just can't use the incidence data. We actually rejected the incidence data in our models, arguing that we had far more data on prevalence and that was probably the more reliable source to work with. So after the analyses in Desmod, when we've come up with a number of prevalent cases for each region, for each country, for each time period, the next thing is to measure the severity of each disease and each consequence of disease, what we call the sequelae. And that's where we worked with disability weights and had disability weight surveys. But it's important to note that it's not just the disability weights from a survey, but we also need the epidemiological information on how the severity is distributed among cases in the community. So about the surveys, there was a large empirical effort with in-person surveys in 4 countries, and a telephone survey in the US, and a large internet survey. We created a parsimonious set of 220 health states to represent the almost 1,200 sequelae that we'd identified for each disease. So there's a lot of doubling up of that between diseases. And it's all based on the simplest way of asking people to give a value by asking people to do pairwise comparisons. A short description of one health state, a short description of another health state, and the question is, who of the two is the healthier? Each respondent in these surveys got a random set of 15 of these pairs, and in addition, we asked the people in the web survey to do a number of those, to do some additional questions called population health equivalence questions, and that helped us to anchor all the results on a scale between 0 and 1. for time, I'll spare you the details of these beautiful heat maps, but maybe move on to this slide that indicates when we plot the overall results against the results that came out of each of the country surveys and the internet survey, that you see very high levels of correlation, with maybe the exception for the survey in Bangladesh, which shows more noise than any of the other surveys. But we did draw a conclusion from this that there was a high degree of consistency, and that despite having conducted these surveys across very diverse cultural settings and with big differences between the respondents, which tended to be much less educated and much poorer in the country surveys as opposed to the people who put up their hand in the internet surveys. A separate case we made for some of the impairments to, like we do with the mortality, to set an envelope. So vision loss is a consequence of many diseases. And so separate data are there to set the limit of how much vision loss there is in the world. And then we made sure that all the individual diseases that lead to vision loss add up to that total, or at least not exceed that total. For injuries, a similar, there's a different approach because you had to deal with both causes of injury and nature of injury. I'm getting distress calls about my time. So on the results, I think this one is important. It shows for males and for females, and Lancet style meant that we had to talk about male individuals and female individuals. The amount of disability, if you add up the disability from all conditions by age, and what you can see is that there's a relatively small change between 1990 and 2010, a much smaller change than the changes that have been shown on the mortality front. But when we look at the difference between 1990 and 2010, we see that at every age group there's a slight improvement. So we have made some inroads into reducing the rates of disability, but not by far as much as the changes in mortality. This is actually trying to unpack that. The overall amount of YLD have gone up by 33%. The rates in green have gone down a little bit, but most of it is just sheer increase in population size and to some extent the aging of the population. This is quite different between those headline categories with much more influence of aging and population increase for the non-communicable diseases as well as injuries, whereas the actual increase in the number of YLD for the infectious diseases has not been that great because rates have come down as they have come down for mortality of those causes. Here the scary graphs with all the colorful steps in them. But it's important here to note that this looks very different, and it responds to one of the questions. It looks very different from the pattern of mortality. In red, we have this huge amount of mental disorders contributing to the non-fatal burden. In green, we have a very large and, in the past, probably underestimated amount of burden from musculoskeletal conditions. Also quite a contribution of injuries to disability, and particularly the long-term consequences of injuries. But it varies by age, and at the youngest ages you can see the neonatal conditions, and at a bit older ages nutritional deficiencies, and in particular anemia being a very large contributor. The sort of variation between regions, but the variation between these major causes that contribute to non-fatal health outcomes is much less than what we see with mortality, with the green bars for musculoskeletal and the red ones for mental disorders applying equally to all parts of the world. I think for time's sake I'll skip this, but of the 5 top conditions I've put here, why are they the top conditions? Because some of them were very surprising. People were very surprised to see back pain up there and neck pain. What they have in common is that they are pretty common to very common, and that the average weighting that we give to them in terms of the amount of health loss is pretty substantial. And so the combination of the two drives these as very important conditions overall in the global burden of disease. So just to finish, if you allow me, so the advances that of this exercise is that it's a far more data-driven process than in the past. We tried where we could to avoid individual researchers making choices that determine estimates. The uncertainty propagating that's been important and quite revealing that some things we know a lot better than others. And we've had this big involvement of all these experts all over the world. That's been fantastic. I think there's much more ownership of the methods that we use and the data that goes into it. But not an easy process. And in the past, we had it as one of the slogans of GBD, decoupling epidemiology from advocacy. That certainly hasn't gone away. The challenges, I think, maybe you already saw in some of those analytical plots, how much data there is that is totally different. Wide range. Some conditions, the data points of 60% prevalence and the data points of next to nothing prevalence. So the true art in doing this is to try and make those data points as comparable as possible. So take out the methodological variation and look for what the true variation in disease experience is. And so it would help a lot if there's a lot more standardization on how people collect this information, so that we don't have to do those adjustments, those crosswalks. Huge data gaps, they're underserved world regions, they're underserved diseases. And one of our surprises was that how little we know about severity. And what people tend to collect is not comparable. And so we really struggled to get plausible information on that. So we have a plea for people to collect in representative samples, but of necessity, these will have to be large data collections where we get a combination of both the diagnostic information and the severity information. And that would allow us, as we for this study done in just a few surveys, to correct for comorbidity. And what we then hope to do is that we can map from the survey work on disabilities into what people self-report about severity of diseases and improve on how we can measure severity of disease. Thank you, and sorry for the time.